Hello. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the last Goldfarb event of the semester. Are you ready for the holiday break? Yes. Are you ready for your finals next week? No. Great. Are you ready to talk to Nathan Law? There we go. Good. All right. To get us started tonight, we are going to have the introduction by Willa Spalter, who is a first year. Woo! Yeah, you can give her some love. Willa is a first year and a member of the Goldfarb Student Executive Board. Willa, over to you.
Good evening. Tonight I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker, pro-democracy activist Nathan Law. He began much of his activism work in 2013 as a college student in Hong Kong. During the Umbrella Movement the next year, Nathan was one of the 5 student leaders that rose to be the face of the movement. He was elected to the Legislative Council of Hong Kong at the age of 23, making him the youngest legislator in Hong Kong's history. On the council, he represented the Demosisto political party, a pro-democracy party that he co-founded. A year after he became a lawmaker, he was imprisoned for 8 months by the Chinese Communist Party for his role in the Umbrella Movement. He has since been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize and has been named Time Magazine's People of the Year in 2020 for his activism work. Nathan has a master's degree in East Asian Studies from Yale University and is a Pritzker Fellow at the University of Chicago. He currently lives in political exile in London, and his first book, Freedom: How We Lose It and How We Fight Back, was officially released today.
Thank you, Willa, and I hope all of you got a copy of the book, and Nathan will stick around afterwards to do some book signing for anyone who's interested in that. Nathan, thank you for coming all the way to Waterville, Maine from London. You definitely are the farthest that any speaker has come this semester.
Wow.
We really appreciate that, and your time, your activism, your leadership. We are so grateful for you being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I cannot think of any other reasons good reasons to come to Maine. So it's I should rephrase myself. Any better reasons than coming to Copy College? So thanks so much for the invitation, and thanks Willa for the introduction.
Yeah. So actually, let's just start with, how did you get where you are today? What's your story?
So to answer in which sense I got invited by you, so I'm here in Maine. But to a broader stage, yes, I'm currently living in London to live in political exile. I got my asylum status in April. For now, I'm wanted under the national security law, which it was passed last year in Hong Kong. It criminalized free speech. People literally being sentenced to 5 years and 9 months just because they chanted certain slogan in certain protests. So I'm wanted under this law. And if I were to go back to Hong Kong, step foot again in my beloved city, I will be jailed for decades, if not life imprisonment. So that is my current situation. And I think a lot of Hong Kong people share a similar situation as I. We are a group of people who have strong pursuit for democracy, who stick to universal values. We believe in freedom. And those are the things that we've been fighting for decades. And those are the things that the Chinese Communist Party promised Hong Kong people in the 80s when Hong Kong was ready to hand back from the British government to the Chinese government, which Hong Kong was a British colony for more than 150 years. And these things are the governing structure of Hong Kong, which were promised by the Beijing government, but they never kept their promises. So that is actually the foundation of Hong Kong's movement. We were promised our way of life, our system, that we shall enjoy democracy, which we can elect our leaders, and we shall enjoy freedom and autonomy. And for the past few decades, actually starting from the 80s, we've been fighting for these things. For me, I was involved in student activism in the year 2013. It was actually quite a strange decision of mine because I grew up in a apolitical family. My father was a construction worker. My mother was a cleaner. I lived in impoverished area in Hong Kong. I lived in public housing. My parents didn't really talk about social affairs or politics, even though my father swarmed from mainland China to Hong Kong in the late 70s in order to live, in order to have a life, because there were no food in his peasant village when China was having a famine there. And they just want me to grow up and to provide for the family and to provide stability. They never thought that I would be in my position today. So in 2013, as a university student, I felt like I was half intellect and a person who have no burden of life in my later stage. I don't have a family, I don't have children, I don't really have to provide for my family yet. So I decided to be involved in social movement, as many of the other youth would do, because we felt a calling in that era. It was a political reform consultation, and we were trying to pressure the government to implement democracy in 2014. So we had a massive protest in 2014, the same year, that we had a civil disobedience movement, umbrella movement, which some of you may have seen the pictures, people holding umbrella on the street, hundreds of thousands of them occupying the major runway of Hong Kong for 79 days. By then, I was a student leader. I was one of the 5 representatives which negotiated with the government. So that's why I stepped into public spotlight and the attention. And afterwards, I felt like I had a need to answer back people's support and trust, continue to be involved in student activism. I found my political party run for office. Luckily, I got elected. It really shows that our energy and the need for a fresh start, fresh faces in Hong Kong's politics was there. But eventually, these success really triggered a lot of persecution. Beijing government unseated me after 9 months of my service in the council. They basically rewritten our constitution and set up extra condition for one of the process that we have been through, and they amended law retrospectively. So they create a legal loophole to unseat me, and I was in jail. I was actually quite lucky because I was only in jail for a few months. But if you look at a lot of protesters today, they were brought to court for years of imprisonment. And of course, their treatment in jail is definitely much more difficult than when I was having it in 2017. So all these things, if you look at my trajectory as a young person who didn't really have any prior knowledge to politics, and then I decided to step in to become a student leader, and then to become the youngest legislator, to be disqualified. In a month, I went to jail to be an inmate, and for now, I become an exile activist. It's actually rhythming to the deterioration of freedoms in Hong Kong. And when Hong Kong people were having the system back, they didn't really political. They just felt like maybe the Chinese Communist Party would keep their promises to give up democracy. So in the first decade, under the Chinese ruling, it was fine. No one really bring out much protest and much discontent to the government. But slowly, they felt like we wanted to demand for something that they had promised, on which they delayed it. We started to protest, and for me, in 2014, we still had the room of civil disobedience. We still had the room of protesting. And in 2016, I got even elected into the council. But later, when the deterioration of Hong Kong became more and more salient, I lost my seat, I went to jail, and then for now, I may never go back to my beloved city. Looking through the lens of Hong Kong, we can easily discern how fragile freedoms are. Just look in 1 year of the implementation of the National Security Law, which I just mentioned. The civil society in Hong Kong is completely annihilated. Our largest independent media, our largest independent workers' union, many of the political organizations, the organization that hosts Candlelight Vigil on 4th of June in commemorating the Tiananmen Massacre in 1989, these are all disbanded. And if you take lessons from Hong Kong, it has a global implication, which we are all facing, another wave of rise of authoritarianism and democratic decline that happens everywhere, including in your country. And if we have an understanding of how an unchecked government can use a lot of different tools to really cram our civil space and our freedoms in Hong Kong, and by looking at an example of China, we can really discern in some other countries when they're experiencing a decline of democracy, what would the government do to do the exact same thing? So I think that is the implication of Hong Kong. And for me, it's definitely a more personal story. It's a more painful and personal story. But I am always, I always have a wish that through sharing my personal story, sharing the story of Hong Kong, we can cultivate a next generation of young activists or global citizens who really do care about democracy, do care about our freedom, and stop taking our freedom and democracy for granted. These are hard-fought values, and if we live in an era that we just let it slip and we don't really care about these things, we're not acting as guardians of it, it can easily be lost. So I think that is the lesson I learned in Hong Kong.
It's fascinating that you go from starting off talking about how you are a wanted criminal. You come from an apolitical family, and yet at the age of the youngest people in this room is when you started as an activist and really continued to work on what you believed in. I'm curious, what was it like being in prison, and what is it like for your friends who unfortunately are still in prison?
Yeah, I think for me, when you look back, I indeed learned a lot from my experience in prison. You can meet people who you will never meet in your daily life. You meet gangsters, you meet like criminals, quote unquote, and you have experienced that you lived in an extremely controlled environment. But for me, when I was living through it, there were a lot of anxiety and nerve and probably insecurity for me, because I was seen as one of the very first patch of political prisoners who are being imprisoned because of peaceful demonstration. So actually, for the very first few days when I was in jail, the news of my imprisonment was broadcast everywhere in the prison, and everyone tried to peek into my room, which there are some like air window. I felt like I was an animal in a zoo, that a lot of tourists wanted to take a look at me, and it really triggered my not curiosity, but anxiety, because it's actually quite, prison is a place that you can never seek help externally. Everything that you encounter inside it, you can only cope with yourself. And maybe I would encounter dangers. But luckily, all these worries didn't realize, but they have also a feature of trying to trying to erase your sharpness, trying to make you into a completely obedient state. When you're in jail, the only thing that you can talk to the prison guard was, yes sir, sorry sir, and yes sir. So it's something that you cannot say no, and it's something that they try to make you completely obedient, so that you kind of get rid of your critical thinking and your sense of rebellion. In that state, I think a lot of political prisoners have been through the state of trying to keep their minds active, trying to keep their sharpness, and trying to make sure that they are still a political person instead of a person being tamed. I think that was also my struggle.
You know, you're here because of our theme this year. So the Goldfarb Center theme is freedom of speech. And we wanted to look at this not just at our own nation, but look at this from a global perspective. So I'd like to ask you, and what I'm asking a lot of our speakers that are here for this theme, is what does freedom of speech mean to you? What does freedom of speech mean to you?
Well, freedom of speech means that I can campaign for Hong Kong's democracy freely. Because literally, I am being wanted just because I uphold a democratic reform in Hong Kong. I campaign for the international community to hold the Chinese government accountable for the human rights violation. And I believe that Hong Kong people should have their rights to decide the city's future, including their leadership. These notions are being seen as subversion and secession in Hong Kong, just because people dare to challenge the dictatorship of one-party Chinese Communist Party. And I think freedom of speech for me is about how we can really speak it freely without fear for what we pursued. But it also means some other things for some other people. If you think of the Chinese government's intimidation over a lot of people in the US, you can see another side of the threat of this free speech. In 2019, one of the NBA team's general manager, Maury, he spoke in support of Hong Kong protest, and immediately China pulled off all the NBA broadcasts in mainland China. And the executive director of the NBA says that it cost them a huge fortune. These are obvious ways that China uses its mighty economic power to coerce the others and to silence their critics. Maury had to tweet another tweet saying that he retracted his comment on Hong Kong and apologized to the people that may feel offended. Some other cases, just take Hollywood as an example. In 1997, it was the very last movie in Hollywood that had any component of criticizing China's human rights record, because after that, the movie company was basically sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party, and they cannot air anything in China for 5 years. And the other movie companies recognize that, and they just don't want to lose the market. So for around 2 decades, there have not been any movies in Hollywood that dare to criticize the human rights violation in mainland China. And the list go on. If you look at countries like Australia, when Australia wanted to encourage prom into the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic, China responded by using its propaganda, claiming that Australia is a gum under the shoe, that they dare to bring out these notions and block and use basically economic sanction to block imports of a lot of their products to mainland China. These things, of course, also erode our freedom of speech. Just try to imagine if a company ever tries to say something that they consider right, they say that with their conscience, but they will encounter a whole country's power to push back without much support in your own community, to be honest. They would definitely pick a side of trying to stay silent towards these things. But it's also compromising our freedom of speech, of standing up to our values and trying to make a better world. So I think this is also a threat to freedom of speech, which is not necessarily as direct as the threats that I'm facing, but it's also slowly eroding our democratic tradition, especially when people living in a democratic country, even in a democratic platform, a platform being banned in mainland China, they also cannot say things that they want.
So your book is probably not being widely published in China. So the book that just so happens to be released today, which is very exciting, is called Freedom, How We Lose It and How We Fight Back. So first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
Writing a book. Yes, you can clap. Writing a book is no easy feat. We're so happy that we were able to get advanced copies for our students. So talk to us a little bit. We'll see if this will stand up. Yeah, we'll look at that. Talk to us a little bit about why you decided to write this and what is it about besides freedom, but tell us a little bit about what the book's about.
Yeah, so the book is about my story, as I had elaborated in the early part of this section. I really wanted to expand the readership about Hong Kong's problem because a lot of people had watched news clips about Hong Kong's protests in 2019. They already had interest in it, but I really wanted more people to be aware of what's happening in Hong Kong. And by writing down my own story through the lens to look into Hong Kong issue, it makes a more digestible angle for an international audience to consume the complexity of Hong Kong's struggle and also the intensity of it.
Yeah.
And I also want to remind everyone through the lens of Hong Kong and through the case of Hong Kong, that we should definitely be defending our democracy and freedom, especially in the case of we're facing a huge democratic decline. The very notable democratic report FIDEM just issued, saying that in the year 2020, it was actually the first year since 2001 that we've got more autocratic regimes than the democratic ones. And we could obviously observe democratic backsliding not only in undemocratic area, but in like new democracies or even democracies that we all look up to. I think,
are you referring to the United States?
Yes, we all see the trends of it. That's definitely something that I think the rise of authoritarianism play a big part of it. The Chinese government rise for the past 2 decades. A lot of bodies in the international community open their arms to them, but never come up with any mechanism to try to hold them accountable in terms of human rights violation. And I think this situation has to change. The world has been too complacent about the kind of like superiority of the democratic values and the way that we talk about it. But actually, the influence of authoritarian regimes has been going into every room of our lives without our recognition. A lot of problems arise from this process that we don't have the tools to counter it. I really do hope that by bringing out the story of Hong Kong, we have a clearer sense of how authoritarian regime, unchecked power, can erode our society, and we can discern them and kind of like come up of solutions towards it.
So, you know, at the beginning when you're telling your story, I was thinking, okay, so here's this person who, you know, didn't grow up with much, and now you are, you know, you've been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and Nathan is speaking next week at the invitation of President Biden at the Democracy Summit, which I hope to dig into a little bit. But what I was looking back at my notes was, as you talk about, you know, these regimes and what democracy looks like, when I was doing my homework, I saw that China's State Council released a report this past weekend, I assume in response to this Democracy Summit that's coming. And the position paper was titled China, Democracy That Works. And the paper, which I didn't read the whole thing, but argues, you know, that there's no fixed model of democracy, that it can manifest itself in many forms. And yet, as you've been talking about, you know, the 2020 security law, the public policy of China is to silence oppressors and to punish critics. So I guess my question is, does China have a democracy that works? I think I know your answer on that. But actually, really more importantly is, does democracy come in many forms? And is there any nugget of truth that China has an element of democracy or a kind of democracy that's just different than what the United States or others might see as democracy?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. And before answering to it, I think that there's a clarification that when we talk about the problem of China, the first thing is we do not conflate the idea of a country, a regime, and to its people. Many of human rights activists who are criticizing China is actually criticizing the Chinese Communist Party for its behavior, including the suppression to its own Chinese people and the way that they constrain them from their freedom, and also doing a lot of persecution. And we're also not trying to undermine a country of like culture, its history, but we're actually addressing the ruling regime that's brutally persecute or even using tanks to roll over their people, just for the purpose of staying in power. For me, I think it's clear that China is good at using these double speak tactics to try to legitimize themselves. Let's not forget, China is now more sophisticated and technologically advanced than the Orwellian state depicted in the book 1984. They have the largest surveillance system in the world. They have utmost power to conduct all the policies that they want. And if you look at their propaganda in describing their socialist core values, they have 24 of them, and in every street corner in China. And some of them says it has freedom, it has rule of law, as democracy, all the fancy words that we describe, a utopia of universal values, would appear on that 24 core socialist values. But we, of course, understand that many of them don't match the reality. For example, when they talk about rule of law, in China, it's rule by law. The Chinese Communist Party is getting hold of all the legal weapon, and all the courts and judges have to plead allegiance to one single political party. And it's difficult for us to imagine in a more Western rule of law tradition. For example, they're saying that they have freedom, but we of course understand that in China, you can exercise your freedom of speech for once, because after that, you'll be in jail. Whenever you criticize Xi Jinping, immediately gone. Just look at Pang Sui. She posed an allegation to a sexual offense allegation towards one of the former top Chinese Communist Party leader. Her post on Weibo, which is the Twitter version of China, was gone in 30 minutes. No one can search anything about it. It was like disappeared. And she also disappeared. And there were a lot of assurance given by the Chinese government saying that she's all right. But those are not convincing evidence. And most importantly, her allegation to the sexual offense of that top leaders in Chinese Communist Party is never investigated. There is no freedom of speech. There's no freedom of assembly. There's no freedom of going into election and many of other political rights. And let alone democracy, there is no opposition voice. There is no election to leadership. There is no open and fair election. These key features of a democracy are not there. But why China wants to proclaim themselves as a democracy? It's just because they use it, of course, to serve their internal propaganda and also trying to steal those the legitimacy of those terms in order to justify what they're doing. And I think you could easily see that features in regimes alike.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the summit next week. Let's talk about what it is, what you plan to do there, and do you have any hope that the summit could make a difference?
Well, the Summit for Democracy is an initiative from the Biden administration that it gathers more than 110 countries or regions around the world. It provides a platform for these leaders to speak about their thoughts on democracy, and they invite the participation of civil society. And I am honored to be invited to leave a remark in the Summit for Democracy in order to lay out the story of Hong Kong, why we feel like the global democracies should do something on it, and how they can do it. I've already recorded it and sent a remark, so but I can't reveal the content of it. I want to give a surprise to you all, so just make sure you pay attention to it. But I think it's really important because it is for the first time that countries in that number gather together just because they are pursuing the same thing and same value. Even though we can see a variety of different levels of democracies in these countries, but in the name of pursuing freedom, pursuing democracy, I think this is remarkable. And I really do hope that after the summit, they have a year-long action plan, and they have pledges, and they wanted to set common goals. I think it can help craft the idea that we have to start to treat the rise of authoritarianism more seriously than before. We have to relinquish that complacency that we had, thinking that democracy will always prevail. It is not the case. For now, we need a perceptual change, seeing it as a major threat to our international system, to our core values, and start working as a unit to coordinate pushback from these countries. Otherwise, we will see democratic decline continue, and we will lose our freedom of speech everywhere, including in our home country. So I think that is a really good idea to start crafting a new narrative in how we can counter the rise of authoritarianism and get prepared for it.
Yeah. I want to spend a lot of time with Nathan answering your questions. So you might need more time, or maybe you're ready. I'll just see, first of all, we'll get our mic runners ready. If you have a question, raise your hand. Let's just take two at a time today. And if you don't have questions, then I can keep asking. Erica, there's someone right up here to the front, and where's Gabriel? Over here, Gabriel at the very front. We'll do second. Go ahead, and please state your name and your major if you don't mind.
Okay, hi, I'm Ira. I'm a freshman, so I haven't declared a major yet, but leaning towards global studies. And so looking forward towards the future, the legislation that basically allows Hong Kong's special status is set to run out in, I believe, about 20 to 25 years from now. And is there a kind of a way to prepare for that? Is there a way to prepare for Hong Kong coming under Chinese rule, essentially, or a way to extend that legislation?
And then Gabriel right here in the very front, yeah.
Hi, I'm Syed, and I'm a prospective sociology major. I'm a freshman. My question for you is, when you talk about democracy and resistance specifically, where do you draw a line between freedom of speech and hate speech? Because, I mean, if freedom of speech leads to hate speech, do you think it's like justifiable when you talk about resistance specifically?
Good question.
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you for your questions. Yeah, there are some concepts that we have to talk about before I answer your question. So in 1997, when Hong Kong was handed back from the British government to the Chinese government, the one country, two system, which is the governing framework of Hong Kong, was enacted. Under that framework, Hong Kong was promised that we will stay as the way it is for 50 years under the Basic Law, and the Basic Law is produced by the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which the Chinese government and the British government signed in the 80s, which cornered the idea of Hong Kong after 1987. They will still enjoy freedom, autonomy, and gradually move towards democracy. So when we conceptualize in this way, we will understand that the reason why Hong Kong has one country, two system is to make sure that Hong Kong has a separate system from the mainland China, including its political system, its legal system, and its economic system, so that it keeps it as a financial hub, keeps it alive, and most likely to appease Hong Kong people when in 80s and 90s there were massive waves of immigration out of Hong Kong just because they are worried about the prospect of Hong Kong after 1997 when Hong Kong was handed back to mainland China. So when we talk about 50 years and change policy under the one country, two system, we were trying to protect Hong Kong's system. But in effect, it is being annihilated already. If we look at the political system, I grew up learning that Hong Kong enjoys division of power. We have a legislative branch, we have an executive branch, and we have a judicial branch. There are checks and balances in the system. And for now, students are being taught that there's no division of power. There's only executive branch, and the other branches have to listen to the executive branch. This is just one small change in Hong Kong system. But we can easily observe that the idea of Hong Kong, if we're talking about one country, two system, there are lots of elements are already being transplanted in the Chinese government to Hong Kong in the way that they govern China to replace the one in Hong Kong, which is actually so drastically different from it was supposed to be operated. In the original design, it was for the one country to gradually catch up to system. It was for yet the underdeveloped Chinese economy, Chinese society to try to catch up the way Hong Kong was, to move towards a more liberal realm and to move towards a genuine rule of law and division of power. But it's obvious that it goes another way around. So for now, for people who are observing Hong Kong closely, we never see it as one country, two system anymore. We may see it as one country, 1.5, 1.4, 1.3 system, because the fundamental elements of one country, two system, which are freedom, democracy, and autonomy, are just not there. So I think 50 years is already too long for the Chinese Communist Party. They started to canceling the whole system. For your question, I think definitely we should draw a line on free speech on the things that are genuinely violating our democratic values, our values of pursuits. We have freedom of speech not for people that, not for the situation that people can freely attack the others. People can freely say something without any consequence or without any, being held accountability. But I do believe that the emergence of freedom of speech only manifest when opposition came in place. In China, they could always say that we've got freedom of speech, because whenever you say anything that are in support of the government, you're allowed to speak it. And whenever you try to say something that this government declare it was sensitive, you're immediately censored. This is not the freedom of speech that we used to know. In China, there are lots of TV stations, you can choose hundreds of them, but does it mean that you have a genuine choice for it? No, probably you can only choose all those allowed under a certain realm of political reality and under certain guidance or propaganda. But for me, I think freedom of speech only manifests when there is a opposition in place that you can freely criticize, of course, with grounds. You can rationally lay out your accusation and on the basis of respecting the others. So I think that's definitely how I understand freedom of speech. And of course, in different societies, they have different bases, they have different limitation, they have different restriction. But I think its core mission is to protect the space for opposition to the power.
Some more questions from the audience?
Hi, thanks for being here. It's nice to see you in person, actually. So, my name's Harry. I'm a sophomore and stats major with econ minor. And actually, I have two questions. So, I was in Hong Kong back to 2019 when the protests broke out. And actually, there were two groups of protesters, peaceful ones and violent ones. And actually, the peaceful protesters decided to stand away from the violent protesters gradually, because the violent protesters broke like subway station, banks, and even shops along the main street. We know that the Midun Dao. And I'm wondering, what do you think about the violent crime these protesters did? And my second question is, many people interpreted the protest as a young people's expression of dissatisfaction with high living expense in Hong Kong, like extremely high house prices and living expense. So what do you think Hong Kong could improve young people's economic situation? And actually, the last thing I want to point out is sometimes we all know that politics is the art of transaction. So when China's government made a transaction with British government back to last century, actually the legal system was not passed to Hong Kong completely. Even nowadays, the legal system was still half charged by British government and half charged by Hong Kong. So yes, that's all of my questions. Thank you.
That's a lot to unpack, but I think we can still take one more. Any other questions? Can we get right in the middle? Erica, can you pop in the middle? Or pass it all the way up?
Hello, I'm Shay, and I'm an anthropology and philosophy major. So currently, China and the US are arguing and fighting against each other over issues such as the Winter Olympics, which is new. And some people view it as a dangerous sign of a new Cold War. How do you think this background affects the influence of your speeches and other activities, like globally and especially for Hong Kong?
Did you get all that? That was a lot to
I will try.
That was a lot. All right.
I have bad memory, but I'll try to get all of those questions. Well, I think first of all, the use of violence in the process is of course a heated topic. I'm a peaceful, non-violence practitioner, so I never encourage the use of violence. But
do you sometimes think it's necessary, though?
Before we get into it, I think that there's a historical background that we have to recognize. Hong Kong was praised as a city of rally. We have held rallies for decades with thousands, hundreds of thousands of people going down to the street, which they will stay behind, collect all the garbages. They never broke a window, and it was completely peaceful for decades. The reason was, back there, they still had hope that Hong Kong could democratize. They had a sense of waiting, and they had the sense of like the government still fair to them, the police was friendly. But of course, situation changed drastically after how we see the Chinese government using a much hard line to Hong Kong when we had the umbrella movement, which was a peaceful demonstration, peaceful civil disobedience. Actually, in 2014, the government released tear gas. They used baton, and they used a lot of things to attack the protesters. And when we fast forward to 2019, at the very beginning, it was very peaceful. When we look at one of the very first rallies, the largest one in Hong Kong's history took place in 2019, 16th June. There were 2 million people marched down to the street, which is more than a quarter of Hong Kong's population. Just try to imagine if in New York, you've got more than a quarter of the population on the street. If in the whole US, you've got more than a quarter of the population on the street, things would be different. The government would say that, yes, we made a mistake. Maybe the government would disband and all the demands would be met. But in Hong Kong, on the next day of the rally, the government says that we have heard your opinion and we will stick to our plan. Nothing changed. When we talk about the escalation of the force of the protester, we must understand why they made that decision to do it. It was because the government never listened to peaceful demonstration. It was because the police side keep escalating their use of force. I was there when one of those peaceful rally took place. I was being shot at head level, even though with rubber bullet, even though with tear gas, but those were lethal. And just try to imagine when tens or even hundreds of these protests took place, and protesters, they had to face these kind of dangers on a daily basis. And there is no deterrence imposed to the police. None of them, up until now, are being held accountable. None of the policemen were being investigated, were being fired just because of it. On the other hand, they were being promoted. They were being praised of suppressing the protesters. And by putting yourself in that situation, you could really sense that protesters, the only thing they could come up, some of them, was try to use violence as a deterrence to these threats that they encounter. So for me, I never encourage that actions, but if you want to really alleviate the tension, the best way is not saying that violence is wrong. Of course, they know violence is wrong. That's why Hong Kong people really hold their grounds for decades. But it's to try to find a way to say that the police would be held accountable. People using those violence would be held accountable, and there's no need for you to do it. But unfortunately, we've got a system that's so tilted that are protecting these agitators. So I think that is definitely a tragedy. And I think if we wanted to understand the core reason, we must get into that historical context and understanding why once very peaceful protests were involved in that way. So after talking all these, I've already forgotten all the other questions, but I'll try to remind myself.
Winter Olympics?
Yeah, Winter Olympics.
There's one.
Well, I think it's definitely a great opportunity for countries to express their concern over China's human rights violation, not only in Hong Kong, but also for millions of Uyghurs being locked in modern-day concentration camp, and Tibetans and Taiwan. I think definitely countries have an obligation to voice their opposition, even though I know they found a balance not to damage the benefit of the athletes, because these are important occasions for them. So diplomatic boycott, I think, is a fair decision to make. Regarding to the new Cold War narrative, I never used it because I understand that it's impossible for us to go into that containment in the 80s. The global economy is so intertwined, and there are just so much interaction in between countries who are in a dictator's camp and who are in a more liberal camp. So I don't think in the way that we implement those containment strategy, we are in a comparable situation. But if we are talking about is it a competition of ideology? I think yes, it is. We must see in this way. That's how we can protect our democratic values from the attacks of these camps. And actually, who brings out the Cold War narrative first is always the Chinese government. When we learned about how Chinese government portray the world and how they always see the Western values as enemies, as something that they have to annihilate, it's actually them to put in such a situation that they see the universal value and democratic values as their existential threat. If we look at, in 2013, Xi Jinping just assumed power, and he issued document number 9. It's a clear guidance for the officials and for the media in mainland China to obey, to align. It says there are 7 noteworthy problems that they should not discuss, and they must annihilate them in their society, including Western constitutional democracy, including free press, including Western way of rule of law, including civil society. All these things are written black and white in their internal communication in the Chinese Communist Party to say that these things are not allowed to be discussed, and these things are basically destabilizing the hegemony of the government. I cannot see a government with this hostility to the values that we all believe could be a benign figure and could be someone that they felt like they are a peacemaker in the world. So for me, the attitude of positioning the West of the world, or at least the world with different values, into exactly opposite camp had already began in mainland China for years. It's just, I think there has been a lot of complacency and misunderstanding or the lack of knowledge towards the Chinese government resulting into the current stage.
Yeah. We're only going to have time for one more question because I have a few questions I want to end. Oh, look at the hands fly. This is always where it gets good. Erica and Gabriel, each pick a person. Maybe, yeah, Gabriel, you get the back, and Erica pick someone up towards the front. We'll try to get 3 questions. Go ahead back there.
Hi, my name is Kate Spence. I don't know my major, but I'm interested in a Chinese minor. You started at a very young age with all of your work, and you've seen a lot of severe pushback, but you keep going throughout that. With regards to the environmental social activism movement and racial justice movements and all of that, what advice do you have for young activists who are interested in getting into this kind of work?
That was going to be the last question I was going to ask the Safe Force, so
Hey.
thanks, that's great. I forget who has it over here. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Lucy. Thank you. I'm a junior majoring in geology and biology. So my question is, how do you think the protest in Hong Kong can influence either, say, Chinese government's policy in mainland China or like life of people who live in mainland China, and also the reverse, how the people living in mainland China influence protests in Hong Kong? Thanks.
One more question. Sonia, did I see your hand raised? Okay, can you just pass the mic forward a little bit? And then Gabriel, one more up here, and then that will be it, unfortunately. But remember that Nathan will stick around. Did the microphone get passed up here to Sonia? That's okay. Why don't you go ahead while she gets the mic? Yeah,
Oh,
go
okay.
ahead, yes.
Hi, Nathan. And my name is Jimmy, and freshman this year. Haven't decided my major yet, but could be history and math. And my question is, how can you ensure, like, what now you are doing or what you will do in the future is really for the commitment for the freedom and democracy, and avoid become maybe a tool for the big countries to have a struggle or have initiated a battle for the power?
Excellent. Sonia, last question.
Hi, I'm Sonia. I'm a senior government and global studies major, and you just mentioned a few times like the international community and other democratic states and the role they can play in Hong Kong's quest for democracy. So I guess I'm wondering what specifically you'd like to see other countries do to help your cause?
Great. I took notes on all that, so we'll get.
Wow,
we'll get there.
I'm running out of bandwidth.
That's okay. So why don't we start talking about how what you're doing in Hong Kong can affect mainland China, as well as how your commitment to freedom does not make you a tool for others.
Yeah.
And then we'll go on.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think it's also a difficult one to answer because we all know that how powerful the internet firewall in mainland China is, and I've had a lot of talks in many different universities in the US, and there were occasions that after the talk, there were Chinese students came to me. They said that I'm very supportive to your cause, but I'm so worried about being present in the forum and talk about it because they know that they would be listened to and probably they would be reported. I think it's a common understanding among the student group that there is a potential surveillance system in place. For me, the best thing I could do is I'm not sure whether my message could penetrate through those firewalls. Most likely it couldn't. But I can talk to people who are outside of China and hope that they have the same pursuit as I, not necessarily completely overlapping my political belief, but at least for them, they have an understanding of the current situation, trying to change and make their country a better place for human being. So for me, I think that's the most I can do. I can talk to them. I can try to have a more individual level dialogue. But if you're talking about how I can really get my message through, I think it's really difficult, and so does the whole movement because of how restricted and controlled the whole environment in mainland China is. For the question about not being used as a tool, I think it is really funny that this is also a narrative that Chinese propaganda would love to use. Anyone who criticizes China is a tool of Western hostile foreign forces. But for us, the world is not bipolar. We must remember that on the one hand, I can criticize China, and on the other hand, I'm criticizing the US for lots of problems. I lived in the US. I went to school in the US. I understand the problems here. When we approach problems like this, we should not bring out the whataboutism, saying that, you're just like being biased, tilted, being used by the others. We should not cancel our challenges and our accusations by using that way. For me, I really have used a lot of efforts to preserve my credibility. I'm not aligned with any political, like partisan political organization. I'm not being funded by any organizations, being funded by any governmental organizations. In every occasion, I can speak it very loudly. And in every occasion, Chinese government will frame me as an agent, as a CIA agent, as someone who trained by SEAL. But I can always stand my ground very firm because I've never done it, and they can never provide any evidence of having things like this. So I would definitely say that for now and for the future, my work is completely independent of any governmental event, and I will stick to my grounds to be that voice for Hong Kong and for freedom and democracy. So that's my commitment, and I'm 100% sure that any propaganda will claim this. They can never have any proof or evidence because it is just not the facts.
Yeah. So what about the question of what specifically would you like to see in terms of an international response? And then let's end with the question I was going to end with, which was, what's your advice for those who, want to get engaged in activism, particularly because, you were getting engaged in this when you were their age?
Yeah, I think for the international reaction, continue the attention and placing the human rights violation in mainland China, especially in Hong Kong, as one of the key issues. It is really important, especially when exile activists, they have lost platform in their home country. They need that recognition, and they need the platform on the international level to continue their advocacy work. I think these attention and exposure are important. But on the other hand, we of course wanted more actions from them. Make the sanctioning mechanism more regular, protecting democratic countries by blocking access to sensitive industry from these state enterprise, working hard on infiltration and all those threats to exile activists. These are concrete measures that democratic countries could do to kind of protect their values, but also trying to counter the influence of regimes like Russia and like China. So I think these indeed help to alleviate the tension in Hong Kong and to try to make sure that we stick to our ground and we can kind of make, in the long term, maybe we can make China less confident in their totalitarian regime. And regarding to advice to young activists, it reminds me about two things. The first thing is about my election. A month before my election date, I was ranked 13th in 15th list. We've got a proportional election system and we've got 6 seats. And in my constituency, it was the most wealthy. It was also most aged, and also people who are really in the elite class. So all our previous legislators from our region were lawyers, were ex-government officials, were public intellectuals, people ordinary citizens could look up to. So for me, back then, I was at the age of 23. I was still an undergrad student. I was not graduated. I was a protest leader. People suspect that I could only talk about slogans, but not content. People suspect that I'm not experienced enough to be in that position. They felt like I was too green for it. But after several sections of public debate, I proved that that I not only can chant slogan, but I can also talk about policies. I can talk about real politics. The lack of experience of mine was actually an advantage for me, that I can get rid of a lot of old tradition or established way of thinking. And in this difficult time, I can bring forward new solutions and new vision. And for me, being a young person, it didn't mean that I'm an immature adult. I'm actually in a major stakeholder of the society that have our special way of looking into it and how we radiate our idealism and try to reform the society. It doesn't mean that we were not mature. We're just having equivalently important perspective towards the society, which was more like idealistic and progressive than the others. So I think age should not be a limit for you, and you should not limit yourself just because of your youth. I really overturned the tide and became one of the most popular candidates in the election, and I won the seat by a large margin. And the other story is about how I have been through all my journey. My position changes throughout the past 7 years. I was a protest leader, and then I became a popularly mandated legislator, which you had completely different people that you are responsible to and you have to answer to. And after that, I was disqualified. I became an inmate. Just try to imagine your mental roller coaster journey of like disqualified, and then in a month you become an inmate. You're literally degraded from an honorable lawmaker, congressman, to an inmate that you share a cell with 20 others. And then for now, I'm an exile activist. The scope of activism is also completely different. I'm talking to you instead of Hong Kong like citizens.
And today, you're an author.
Yes. I finally
Literally,
have my baby. Yeah, in these different positions, you need to adopt them. You need to have different mindset, different skill sets, and you need to get used to the new environment. And that's how I learned to make myself be water. Water is, you can take different forms to better cope with the situation. And I think it is also important for you all to get an understanding of what is your environment, what are your advantages, your skill sets, and where you could be in an activism arena. Maybe you're good at design, you're good at marketing, you're good at anything else. There's always a position for you. And the only thing that are limiting yourself is that you're not going to try. So I think it's really important, and I've written that idea in the book, and it is the last remark of this talk, that I think how our society treats youth activism is a reflection of how progressive it is. There are a lot of idealism radiated through the lens of youth. They are so precious. They are always spearheading the changes. And we just have to listen to them, and we have to learn from them. Yeah. And I think it is really important for us to bear that in mind and just be the voice of yourself.
Great last words, great advice. I want to thank Nathan. I also want to thank those who joined us on the live stream tonight. We're so glad that you watched, or for those who are watching this recording later. And thank you to all the Colby students who came out when I know it's a stressful week and I know you're ready to go home. Thank you so much, Nathan. Let's give him a warm applause.
Thanks so much.